that, so Israel was able to spread itself. And having done that, having done that, it's then began to shape itself, and then say, sort of present itself as a best friend of Africa, as almost like not an empath, but like, we all have the same issues. We are suffering from the Arabs giving blockading us. There was an Arab blockade at the time. You Africans, we know what you're like. We know what you're going through. We can all work together. Now, like Azad said, agriculture. I've spoken about development. Azad, I can't remember whether he mentioned technology, security, he mentioned. We look at all of this, and in today's world, what are the important things? We know that there's a global food shortage. Africa needs to start feeding itself. Okay, so you've got agriculture, and they're right there. You have development. Africa is under development. They've been there forever. Then you have the security. Well, we have domestic terrorism all across, especially in the Western Africa. And who are the people responsible for those domestic terrorism? The same Israel's colonial big brothers are the ones responsible. So it all begins to take shape, right? And now, one of the things that I'd like to say is Suraya Dadu wrote an excellent piece, I believe it was last year, where she talked about spyware. And Nigeria spent something like 10 billion, I can't remember over how many years, on spyware. And the number one supplier of spyware in Nigeria was Israel. Now, bring it back to today, right? Of course, there's Russia, and then there's China, but the number one supplier is Israel. Now, when we bring it back to today, just 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, possibly, I think they call her the vice minister of foreign affairs from Israel. She was in Nigeria. She had meetings. She didn't meet with the foreign minister, the minister of foreign affairs. She met with his junior minister, who we call the minister of state for foreign affairs. So that's the junior minister. Her name is Bianca Ojukwu. Now, they met, and there was a press release came out saying, Nigeria is going to be collaborating with Israel. I paraphrase now: security, agriculture, and culture. So I'm thinking, I don't understand what culture. What culture are they collaborating with? I mean, what is the culture between Israel and Nigeria? There isn't one. But here's what there is, and most people don't know this. There are Israelis here who are within the arts and culture industry, at least one of them I know, who, for all intents and purposes, these guys as Nigerians, and but they actually recruit for Israel, for universities in Israel. So that must be what they mean. I mean, this particular person is in the arts and culture dance space. And, up until October 7th, none of us knew what she was. Really, she was just this woman that was in the arts and culture industry, right? We didn't know who she was. But it's only after October 7th that I started to do my research, and I'm thinking, this is interesting. But anyway, to cut a long story short, since she pulled down all her posts, but that doesn't mean she's not. So you have those people. You then have the government, our government. Now, from what I understand from my sources, Nigerian government has not signed anything with Israel. That's what my sources are telling me. However, Israel has put it out there that they are signing a big security, agriculture, yada yada contract with Nigeria. Indeed, when you go onto the Israeli, and this will shock all of you, when you go onto the Israeli ambassador's website in Nigeria, he's listed as a member of ECOWAS. ECOWAS is West Africa. What is Israel doing in ECOWAS? Israel was actually expelled from the AU just a few years ago. I believe it was even Nigeria that spared that expulsion. So I don't understand, but there's clearly some sort of machinations going on as to how to get back into the fold with Africa. Well, Nigerians, I can speak for. We're a funny kind of people. Those who have voice and are unafraid to use their voice are anti Nigeria signing any pact with Israel. Indeed, there's been many articles that has come out since that meeting that Nigeria must not get involved. Nigeria cannot afford to actually sign any sort of contract with Israel at a time when the world is actually, pulling away from Israel. But alas, we wait and see. So going back to what we were saying, I'd like to leave us with this. When Ben Gurion talked about Greater Israel, he didn't just mean Greater Israel in land, because a Greater Israel is going to need economy. They're going to need economic growth. Unlike the colonial big brothers, where do they come when they want to steal from the land? They come to Africa. So Israel is coming back. Whatever partnership it's doing, yes, part of it is to do with this possible expulsion, ethnic cleansing of Gazans to Sudan. But beyond that, the Israeli economy has gone through hell. The Israeli economy is not strong. It's extremely weak at the moment, in spite of what they're saying. Indeed, the Israeli economy knows that they need external foreign trade. And where do they need all the minerals, like everybody does, right? They present themselves as experts in agriculture. Well, so are the Palestinians. But in Nigeria, the Israeli ambassador in Nigeria went round soon as the Palestinian ambassador left, and there was a sort of void in between replacing them. The Israeli ambassador went on a what do you call it, on a tour, selling Israel as the best agriculture partner. So back to where I was going, just so I'll shut up. Israel needs business. Africa, just like the times when they divided Africa in the Berlin meeting, I can't remember the exact words. It is always, always, always a business plan. Africa is their business plan. What we as Africans must do is to ensure that business plan is not successful. I'll leave it there.
Israel, and it's not only limited from the river to the sea, but it is way beyond, and particularly in economic terms. But Mariam, I just want to focus, and I would like to cite Morocco as an example. Now we know Morocco has normalized ties with Israel. Morocco in itself is an occupier of the Sahrawi people, Western Sahara as well. And I know, you wanted to obviously highlight this normalization and what it meant. Despite we see the sentiment on the ground in Morocco, vehemently opposed to this genocide, but yet this is a country that we least expected to actually normalize ties with Israel, yet they did.
No, definitely. I think, it also ties back into what Ireti was saying about the business plan, right? So essentially, what Israel needs is trade. And what Africa wants, of course, is also investment. But we have to look at, just before we move to Morocco, I think, we're not really understanding to what extent the Zionists are so close to home. And we need to look at, for example, Lesotho. Last year, 2024, which is, amidst the genocide, there was actually a summit held in Ethiopia, Africa-Israel Summit, in which, countries, including Lesotho, attended. So it was Ethiopia as the host. Then you had Ivory Coast, Seychelles, Gabon, and Guinea-Conakry, and Lesotho, as I said. And essentially, what they did was to bring parliamentarians. So you're having parliamentarians as people who are involved in the making of legislation in the domestic context of those countries, who are engaging with the Israeli state, as development partners. And what they had to do initially, or at least what the aim of that summit was, according to the reports, was firstly to affirm Israel's right to exist, and then to declare that Jerusalem would be the capital, the undivided capital, importantly going against the UN resolutions, and also to enhance bilateral cooperation. So what we're seeing here, I mean, if you look at it from a political lens, the analytical lens, what they essentially are trying to do is what the colonialists have always done, and that is to divide. So instead of going through the UN or going through blocks that are established like the AU, which has a strong and pro-Palestinian sentiment, what they're doing is bilateral trade. So you essentially bypass the regional blocks, and you then say, look, it's between the two countries, these are our terms, and it's favorable because we can provide you with A, B, and C. And as was mentioned before, a lot of it has to do with military agreements, but also tech. I mean, drone technology is now the way things are going, and we mustn't, underestimate the extent to which drone technology has actually exacerbated the conflicts, particularly in Sudan and in the DRC. And the Sudan is actually a very good example because Israel is supporting both sides. How? Because they support the UAE, and they also have a very strong relationship with Egypt. And Egypt and the UAE are supporting the opposite sides, the SAF and the RSF. So essentially, what Israel is doing is basically just covering all bases so that it would still have access to the minerals in Sudan. And we know that the RSF in particular have been funding the war through the smuggling of gold through Darfur, out of Darfur to the UAE. So basically what it comes down to is this business plan. But we as citizens should not be allowing parliamentarians. I mean, how does Lesotho even allow their parliamentarians to engage with Israel on that level when essentially their largest neighbor, or whatever you want to call South Africa in context to Lesotho, has taken the country to the ICJ? So here we question what is the value and the efficacy of regional bodies like SADC, the AU. To what extent are we? And for example, we've celebrated, the delinking of Mali and Burkina Faso and so on from ECOWAS out of anti-colonial sentiment and so on. That's how it's been reported. Ibrahim Traore is supposed to be an anti-colonial figure at this point. But why are they strengthening ties with Morocco? Why have they recognized Morocco's occupation of the Sahrawi as legal? So, there's a lot that's going on here in the sense that Africa needs to find ways in which it can actually coordinate intra-trade. And that is the key. So we have to look at alternatives to the Chinese, alternatives to the Russians, alternatives to the US and to the EU, and look at intra-trade, intra-Africa trade. And if we look at Asia and how that's worked as a model for Asia, it's phenomenal. And so, again, like I say, we need to look at what's happening closer to home. And that's also where Christian Zionism becomes a very important and actually critical element. Because why would Africa be receptive to Israel if it was not couched in the biblical language that it is at the moment? You have the president of Malawi saying, these countries that are those who are part of this initiative know the deserts of Africa will bloom again when they start blessing Israel. So you're willing to partner with the genocidal state so that your deserts can bloom while olive groves and Palestinian water access is being denied. So we've lost this understanding of what it means to be human. So this understanding of Africans versus Asians and Europeans has to stop, because we have to understand that there is one goal. And if I'm able to eat at the expense of a Palestinian dying, then what is the value of that?
Yes, Mariam. Azad, earlier on you spoke about constraints on the African continent, and one of the constraints you spoke about is budgetary constraints as well. And as we head towards the end of this broadcast, we do have about 6 minutes left. And just to find a way forward, and particularly with this, well, with Ajax that Ireti had formed as well, and some of the critical or key issues that African journalists need to consider, particularly under the circumstances, under the conditions that we find ourselves in as African journalists or media people or media personalities. And particularly, I know Mariam spoke about social media as an option, but just looking at journalism, mainstream journalism on the African continent in highlighting many of these issues that we have been speaking about.
Again, a good question, but a big one. You see, there's so many dimensions to this again, and one has to consider, as Ireti said, about the history of Israel's connection with the continent, and how it came in originally. And those kinds of things can last for a long time, for more than one or two generations, right? People coming in and essentially presenting or projecting themselves as helping, right? And that takes a long time for people to sort of like remove. And you think about the USAID, right? On one hand, USAID, when Trump basically killed so much of the program, there were all these concerns that people are going to actually die. And on the other hand, there were all these other kind of celebrations that maybe we will break away from this. And in the meantime, the story is in between, right? It's a very complicated story. And you wouldn't often necessarily get that in many of the African media. You wouldn't get that necessarily even in the US media. So in the US media, you would see sort of like the liberal media would say, how could Trump do this? This is going to end, America's influence, as if America's influence is a good thing, right, on the continent. And then essentially they would kind of undermine what it means. In terms of what the USAID actually meant for Africa and how it created this dependency, including other kind of adjacent programs like the Bill Gates Foundation and all of these kinds of things, right? So what I'm trying to say is that this is a huge problem, a huge problem, which Gaza and Palestine and the story that that we aren't able to tell properly about this genocide in many African, mainstream presses or publications is kind of a manifestation of all the other kinds of stories that we're not able to tell. And so what I mean by that, there's a huge parochialism in many of these African countries, especially the big ones. So, okay, Africa is not a country, right? We know this, right? So not every country is the same. Mariam also kind of alluded to kind of like the community media, right? In places like we have a great sort of ecosystem of community media in South Africa, because of the availability of funding and other kinds of resources. But other African countries don't have that necessarily. But what I mean is that if you think about how South Africa covers the rest of the continent, it's just as bad. It's just as bad as how they cover. In Nigeria, Central African Republic could be on Mars for most of South African publications. This is the truth, right? So when you think about Gaza, it's only natural that they're going to take what they're being told is the truth, because they don't know any better. And so much of our education, our curriculum, the Holocaust Center in Cape Town, I just did a story about that. They have their tentacles, and I hate to use that word, but it's true. They have sort of their tentacles in the curriculums in our education department. So that creates a kind of cover, for Israel, and it kind of undermines all the other kinds of things that are going on the continent. So, for me, like it's very hard to see a silver lining. However, meeting people like Ireti and conversing with people like Mariam, especially on this sort of this new group African Journalists Against Genocide, creates the possibility for more connections and creates the possibility for more interactions and swapping of information, and also kind of getting more like-minded journalists together. Because part of this is that a lot of the time, sort of, and I'm sorry for taking up so much of your last few minutes, but this will be my final point. So much of the time when young journalists are spotted in many of these countries, they are plucked out and taken to the US, taken to the UK, taken to Europe, and they are trained in those ideals. And then they come back, and if they have a Harvard degree behind them or some other kinds of, Stanford journalism training, then they get to dictate the terms locally, when actually they're just coming with a very flawed way of looking at journalism, looking at the continent as well. So maybe if we are able to kind of cultivate these closer ties between us, as Mariam said, like, having closer intra-trade instead of inter-trade. So in the same way, journalists talking to each other on the continent more, perhaps you are able to identify stories in each other's places as well as in ourselves in a better way.